Buenas tardes. Un saludo a todas y todos. Les agradecemos por su presencia en este espacio. Este es el primero de una serie de eventos públicos que hacen parte de este evento que estamos organizando entre el Departamento de Antropología y el Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de los Andes. Un evento titulado Religiones insumisas, protestas sociales y democracias hoy. El evento tiene dos objetivos principales. Buscamos poner en diálogo voces estimulantes, inspiradoras en el estudio interdisciplinario de lo religioso y de los cruces entre religión y política, entre la academia norteamericana y la academia latinoamericana. Ese es el primer objetivo. Y el segundo objetivo es poder conversar y reflexionar sobre los cruces entre religión y política, entre el trabajo académico y procesos de organización social de base y movimientos sociales. Por eso también tenemos el gusto de contar con la participación de algunos liderazgos sociales, de procesos organizativos de base que nos acompañan desde distintas regiones. Gracias. Este evento también vale la pena mencionarlo, es el evento de cierre de un proyecto de investigación sobre religiosidades, espiritualidades y construcción de paz en Colombia, que venimos desarrollando desde hace ya 2 años y medio, junto con la profesora Alena Caicedo y varios estudiantes de distintas carreras de ciencias sociales que nos han acompañado en este proceso. En este proyecto de investigación nos ha interesado ver el alcance y la incidencia de formas de religiosidad y de espiritualidad popular en distintos escenarios de movilización social en Colombia en los últimos años, y cómo pensar esa relación nos ayuda también a entender mejor el alcance de estos espacios organizativos de base, de estos movimientos sociales, para construir paz local en circunstancias como las de los últimos años, que han sido en muchas regiones de Colombia y en varias de las cuales tenemos líderes y lideresas que nos acompañan, territorios que han sufrido formas de violencia cruenta y crónica en los últimos años. Este primer evento público de esta conferencia nos da el privilegio de escuchar a la profesora Shakman Hurd. Elizabeth es politóloga y profesora en el Departamento de Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Northwestern en Evanston, Illinois. Y Elizabeth también tiene allí la cátedra titulada Crown Chair in Middle East Studies. Elizabeth hizo su pregrado en Wesleyan University, su maestría en Yale University y su doctorado en Johns Hopkins University. Es una de las voces más autorizadas y más interesantes, sin duda, para pensar el papel de la religión en formas de gobernanza transnacional en el mundo contemporáneo. Elizabeth, mencionaré algunas de sus publicaciones más representativas, pero antes de ello, pues quisiera mencionar también la importancia que ha tenido su trabajo en nuestro proyecto. Elizabeth nos ha insistido cómo el secularismo opera en escenarios de gobernanza transnacional, no tanto como la neutralidad del Estado frente a las distintas expresiones religiosas, como tendemos o estamos acostumbrados a pensarlo, sino como realmente el secularismo funciona como una forma específica de gobierno de lo religioso, que hace que ciertas formas de religiosidad tengan cabida en la esfera pública, pero que al mismo tiempo margina o invisibiliza la dimensión y el alcance político de otras formas de religiosidad o espiritualidad vivida. Su trabajo explora esa tensión entre lo que ella llama la religión gobernada, que es la forma como los estados y los escenarios de gobernanza transnacional gobiernan y disciplinan las prácticas y los discursos religiosos, y lo que llama la religiosidad vivida, que es la forma como la gente experimenta la religiosidad como una parte vital de sus vidas a nivel individual y colectivo, y algo muy importante para nuestro proyecto, como ese escenario de la religión vivida es un escenario creativo, tanto a nivel de la praxis política como al nivel de las formas en las que nos permite teorizar de otras maneras novedosas y esclarecedoras los fenómenos sociales y políticos en nuestra contemporaneidad. Elizabeth ha publicado una lista muy larga de artículos académicos, no voy a mencionarlos, voy a mencionar algunos de los libros más representativos. Comparative Secularisms in a Global Age es una publicación de 2010. The Politics of Secularism in International Relations es una publicación de Princeton University Press del año 2008. Su libro más influyente fue publicado en el año 2015, Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion. Recientemente tiene 2 coediciones sobre temas fascinantes, una de ellas, Theologies of American Exceptionalism, coeditado con la profesora Winifred Fuller Sullivan y publicado en el año 2020. Elizabeth, es para nosotros un placer, un privilegio. Estamos muy agradecidos y muy contentos de con tu presencia, y bienvenida y muchas gracias.
Gracias, Carlos. Thank you again for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I promise to speak very slowly for our translators. I also want to thank you back there in the booth for your patience with translating this. You can go ahead to the next slide. So a few years ago, we landed in Chicago, where I live, on a hot July afternoon with our 3 crabby kids in tow. And it was our first time going through customs since having been approved for global entry pending the interview. The Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, officer who was assigned to my family seemed very friendly. Following questions about our travel and our jobs, in which I mentioned that I taught US foreign policy, and sensing that our interview was coming finally to an end, I asked him, do we need to go back through that line for the kids, which stretched for at least a couple of hours worth of standing? Do you want to go through that line? He joked, smiling and gesturing in the direction of a long queue for US passport holders. As I waited for the officer to return our documents, his expression suddenly changed and his body language became tense. You know, everything you see on TV about what's happening on the border, it's a lie, right? He said. Really? I said. Yeah, you know, all that crap about kids being held in cages and all that, it's all lies. I know because I saw with my own eyes. I spent 6 weeks down there on the border, down south. I just got back. He didn't want to credit his statement in the face of so much evidence to the contrary, including a series of revelations about the horrible conditions, in particular for children and families, on the border in a report that had come out the previous week, a report authored by his own employer, the Department of Homeland Security. On the other hand, he was holding our passports, and he spoke with conviction. He needed what he said to be true. I was reminded of this exchange later in reading Vincent Lloyd's discussion of the move toward political theology in the study of American law and culture. As Vincent explained, I use his first name because he's sitting right here, as Professor Lloyd explains, this is not only about the way ostensibly secular figures with partially submerged theological histories continue to animate political life, but also about alternative modes of engaging in political life that tap resources irreducible to secular reason. Next slide. The nation state also taps into these resources. Although the American state is usually not seen or conceived as religious in any conventional sense, it is understood as a political entity that stands at some distance from modernist understandings of religion as faith tradition. The CBP officer also tapped into resources irreducible to secular reason to defend measures taken in the name of national security. I think the organizers of this workshop are correct when they speak in the introduction that they gave us of the need to re-entangle the religious in the social world's flesh. Direct quote from them. I hope to contribute something small toward this effort today in a discussion of the American state's theological discourse of national security. There are very few legal constraints, whether constitutional or statutory, that hinder the executive branch in the United States if its actions can be justified as pursuant to the national interest or furthering national security. Scholars of US and international law debate these constraints, but the extra legal aspects of sovereign authority go missing. Next slide, please, Carlos. Thank you. Jyoti Raja has described an affective conviction in the United States as transcendent. She notes that there's a paradox that marks the narrative of law, nation, and authority in the instance of the United States. While law and nation refer to each other and find authority in each other, there is a subversion of secular modernity. The narrative of law, nation, and authority constructs the United States as itself transcendent, the US as sacred in some sense. This, of course, evokes Paul Kahn's definition of the central claim of political theology. Not that the secular should yield to the church, he writes, whatever church that might be, but rather that the state is not the secular arrangement that it purports to be. For Kahn, as perhaps also for Raja, sovereignty is incomprehensible strict of its theological origins. Of course, this taps into a very long discussion in political theology, as you all know. Ernst Kantorowicz famously traced the transferences and exchanges between church and state and the gradual emergence of what he calls the secular corpus mysticum in the king's two bodies, writing that the corpus mysticum proper came to be less and less mystical as time passed on, and came to mean simply the church as a body politic, or by transference, any body politic of the secular world. In her compelling update of Kantorowicz's tracing of the migration of religious metaphors across modern domains, Winifred Fowler-Sullivan examines transferences and exchanges of the charisma of the collective among the corporate legal fictions that we call today state, church, and corporation. Winnie shows how the pooling of their various charismatic resources has enabled particular collective human projects over time. There is a sense, she writes, in which there is a profound interchangeability among the church, the state, and the corporation. The state and the corporation borrowing from the church the sign of the sovereign as sacred. Telling this story allows her to redescribe and to parochialize the history of US disestablishment, as what she calls the project of realizing distinctively American churches in law. The American border is one component, one site, one aspect of this secular corpus mysticum that composes and comprises the modern state. The border is a face, or really series of faces, of the exercise of state sovereignty, which, if we follow Kantorowicz, Sullivan, Robert Yell, and others, traverses modern constructs of secular and religious, and as we were discussing in our earlier panel, confounds modernist claims and aspirations to separation and differentiation. Part of its efficacy then, as a form of political and legal discipline, lies in this capacity to evade categorization. My current work explores different political theological grammars of border politics and some of their implications. I talked a little bit about America-Israel this morning. Today I'm going to talk about national security. Now, in most narratives, as I'm sure you know, national security is founded or relies on a division of religious and secular. Religion comes in from outside politics, public policy, law. Bad religious actors threaten national security. Salutary religious actors enhance national security by partnering with the government to advance the national interests. This is the conventional narrative. These constricted modern conceptualizations of religion that I discussed in my book, Beyond Religious Freedom, obscure, I think, the rich transferences and exchanges between religious and secular that actually shape border politics and policy. Thank you. So today I'm going to reread the controversy surrounding what was popularly called the Muslim ban, or Proclamation 9645, and talk a bit about the 2018 Supreme Court decision in Trump v. Hawaii that upheld it. In this decision, the court delimits or confines its consideration of religion to a discussion of anti-Muslim animus. While anti-Muslim animus is important, confining the discussion of religion to the problem of anti-Muslim animus displaces attention from another aspect that we need to consider, which is the political theology of national security. In the US, I want to suggest, there's like a thing up there. Can you just put réclamer, whatever it says? Thank you. Then you can read it. Thank you. In the US, it's national security, not religion, seems to me, or not only religion, that is vested with the power to transcend human limitations in the name of control, order, and social harmony. It is national security that stands beyond the reach of the limits of the human, that invokes the exception, that authorizes the simultaneous enforcement and suspension of the law, which is what we saw in this case. National security emerges as a political theology, or a kind of public or civil religion. It enjoys broad bipartisan appeal among US officials, most political scientists, constitutional law experts, and the general public. To proselytize in the name of national security is not only admired, but expected. This is the case for liberals, conservatives, Christians, non-Christians, the religiously indifferent. It's not understood as religious, but as nonpartisan and non-sectarian. Next slide, please. So within a week of becoming president in January of 2017, Trump issued an executive order called Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. It suspended entry for citizens of Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and was enjoined in the federal district courts. He then rescinded it and signed a new executive order with the same title and nearly identical bans. This became known as EO2, the second version, and it banned temporarily entry of both immigrant and non-immigrant nationals of 6 of the 7 predominantly Muslim countries identified in the first ban. And it was enjoined before it took effect. He then came up with a third iteration, 9645, enhancing vetting capabilities and processes for detecting attempted entry into the United States by terrorists or other public safety threats. It's quite a mouthful. And that was issued in 2017, was also challenged in the courts. And in October of that year, a federal district court in Hawaii granted a nationwide injunction barring enforcement. This proclamation, the third version, blocked citizens of banned countries from obtaining various US immigrant and non-immigrant visas by placing entry restrictions on the nationals of 8 states whose systems for sharing information the president deemed inadequate. The lead counsel for the plaintiffs challenging the ban described it as a ban on foreign nationals' entry to the country using a facially neutral policy that predominantly impacts Muslim majority nations. The AP described it more colloquially as a watered down version intended to withstand legal scrutiny. The Ninth Circuit upheld the Hawaii District Court's decision, observing that the proclamation likely contravened 2 provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. I can go into the details of that later, but I'm going to skip that for a translator's sake. It's so wordy. They didn't reach the Establishment Clause claim at all. So the lawsuit that finally reached the Supreme Court in 2018 was brought by the state of Hawaii, 3 individuals with foreign relatives affected by the ban, and the Muslim Association of Hawaii. The plaintiffs alleged that the primary purpose of the ban was religious animus, and that the president's stated concern about vetting protocols and national security were mere pretexts for discriminating against Muslims. On June 26, the Supreme Court reversed the Ninth Circuit's decision and remanded the case for further proceedings, ruling 5-4 in favor of the government. In this opinion, the majority confined their consideration of religion to anti-Muslim animus, which they then set aside in deference to national security and the plenary power doctrine, which is a legal rule granting the president exceptional power in foreign and immigration policy. I'm speeding up, I can feel it. The dissent set aside national security as irrelevant, emphasizing instead the role of anti-Muslim animus as motivation for the ban. They said this is not about national security, but anti-Muslim animus. The decision led to protests among leftists and progressives in particular, who accused the majority of racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and of overturning while also reinstating the infamous Korematsu decision, a 1944 Supreme Court decision sanctioning the internment of Japanese Americans and upholding an exclusion order. Given the rampant anti-Muslim rhetoric at the highest levels of the US government during the Trump administration, it's not surprising that there were protests against these actions. But the narrow focus on anti-Muslim animus on all sides elided 3 important insights. It obscured the fact that the 7 countries targeted in the ban were actually identified and restricted in changes to the visa waiver program under the Obama administration. It failed to consider that anti-Muslim sentiment has long been integral to US constructs of national security. And that, as Nadia Marzuki has argued, the law and the courts have played an important role in contributing to, while also at times mitigating this situation. Third, and what I'll focus on in the remainder of my time, confining the religious dimensions of this controversy to anti-Muslim animus obscures the broader political theological aspects of national security that lie at the heart of this case. For both the majority and the dissents, it is national security that remains untouchable. This collective reverence for national security is expressed through at least 2 channels. The first is via the extraordinary deference to the executive that I mentioned a moment ago, the plenary power doctrine. The majority argued that even if one were to assume that anti-Muslim animus had been an important motivation for the ban, that assessing motivation for the orders falls outside the purview of their authority. Since the founding, the US president has exercised extraordinary authority in national security, immigration, and foreign relations. Though this was briefly checked during the Watergate era, the congressional framework that was put in place to constrain the president has eroded. Since 9/11, both parties have unleashed unlimited presidential powers in the name of national security. This decision reflects a longer trajectory of extreme deference to the executive. Chief Justice Roberts said, by its terms, 1182F exudes deference to the president in every clause. In other words, the president's anti-Muslim rhetoric didn't really matter, given the extensive purview of presidential authority in these areas. The plenary power is a set of legal rules in which setting the rules for entry and exit and determining the status of aliens are understood as federal powers that are largely insulated from judicial review. Plenary power over immigration, according to one immigration law professor and a colleague of mine, is rooted in the stark racism of the late 19th century. The bottom line is that US presidents are pretty free to express religious animus, and the law will continue to protect their right to regulate the border. National security interests allow the president to discriminate. The president's authority in this domain sits within, but also outside and beyond the law. The elevation of national security beyond the reach of the law is also strengthened by the discursive framing of the controversy. Both advocates and critics agreed the ban was motivated either by religious animus, in which case it was illegal, or by national security, in which case it was legal. Not only the majority, but also the concurrence in both dissents shared this foundational assumption. Roberts wrote, the ban is expressly premised on legitimate purposes and says nothing about religion. The dissent countered, the ban is motivated not by security, but religious animus, rendering it unconstitutional. The majority, the dissent, Kennedy's concurrence, and Breyer's dissent all presume that the ban either rests legitimately on a national security justification or illegitimately on anti-Muslim bias. Interestingly for me, many of the commentators who were highly critical of the ban echoed this framing. It was like they're stuck in a loop. Faiza Patel of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program wrote, the Muslim ban has been in effect for over a year, upheld by the Supreme Court, despite overwhelming evidence that it was motivated by religious animus, not national security. Justice Sotomayor's dissent took up the banner of religious freedom, admonishing the majority for abandoning our constitutional commitment to religious liberty and insisting that the proclamation runs afoul of the Establishment Clause's guarantee of religious neutrality. She notes, a reasonable observer would readily conclude that the proclamation was motivated by hostility and animus toward the Muslim faith, and that the proclamation was driven primarily by anti-Muslim animus, rather than by the government's asserted national security justifications. The First Amendment, she concluded, stands as a bulwark against official religious prejudice and embodies our nation's commitment to plurality and tolerance. Legal and religious historians, however, have documented the patchy and partial protection and privileging of particular forms of religion by the court throughout US history. Next slide, please. The First Amendment does not and never has really stood as a bulwark against religious and racial prejudice, particularly when national security and border security are involved. Here you have a leaked memo from the CBP Seattle field office. Hopefully, yeah, you do. Showing that CBP ordered border agents to interrogate, report, and detain individuals of Iranian heritage, regardless of citizenship status, after the US-sponsored assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Press reports indicate that more than 60 Americans of Iranian descent, as well as numerous lawful permanent residents, were held at the Peace Arch, US-Canadian border crossing in Blaine, Washington, in secondary inspection, and also questioned at length based on the instructions you see here. On the right, you have an excerpt from this memo, which says, even if they are not of Shia faith, and the capitalization is in the memo, just to make a point, anyone can state they are Baha'i. Please question further to determine this is the case. When in doubt, send for high side checks. What NTC is looking for is membership in a specialized unit, Quds Force. However, this group is so elite and well-trained to evade. Anyone can state they are from a different faith to mask their intentions. Sotomayor also accuses the majority of making a superficial claim of national security, implying that a legitimate claim could have led to a different outcome, perhaps even justifying the ban. Discriminatory treatment of non-nationals at the border is the law, regardless of political party. Institutionalized discrimination is an effect of an international order based on sovereign claims to land. Victims of discrimination include the Japanese during World War I, the Chinese in the early 20th century, and all of those designated as internal threats. The ban is not exceptional in this regard. It's actually more like the norm. As May Nai and others have shown, the law is especially poorly equipped to address this situation because it is in part responsible for creating it. Looking ahead and moving away a bit from this particular case, I realize we can get bogged down. My sense is that new thinking at the intersections of political theology, political theory, religious studies, and border studies might inform a more nuanced understanding of the political theological character of the nation state and the multiple paradoxes that inform US border politics and policy. This responds to a collective sense in our field that we need to decenter Eurocentric images and understandings of political theology. We need to create space for new thinking. Carlos Manrique, drawing on Foucault, asks, how can we think of political theology as a theoretical and political field beyond its Eurocentric canon? And how might that hearken a philosophy of the future? In her book on the Nouvelle Théologie of the 1930s and 1940s in France, Sarah Shorthall also criticizes the shortcomings of conventional political theology. Taking its cue from Carl Schmitt, she writes, this literature has tended to focus on the pre-modern theological origins of modern political concepts, treating theology as something that existed in the past, but whose formal features have now been taken over by the political. Shorthall concludes, the history of the Nouvelle Théologie invites us to rethink what constitutes a political act and where the boundaries of the political lie. Noah Solomon, in For Love of the Prophet, agrees, writing that non-state Islamic actors in Sudan sought to rethink not only how to Islamize politics, but also what counted as political in the first place. This image of the border and the many modes of subverting it and resisting it that emerges from my reconsideration eludes the political religious divide in which border security is framed as a political or security issue that non-state religious actors contest from the outside. Instead, national and border security is religious and political at the same time, kind of simultaneity of the political religious. As Manrique points out, thinking politically and theologically in the Americas also requires going beyond, quote, the question of the establishment and conservation of the social order in the sovereign instance of a dominant juridical regime and its constitutive states of exception, which is where other canonical contributions to political theology have placed their emphasis. He draws our attention to forms of resistance from below that defy, contest, and remake social orders. Passages between the political and religious inform opposition to actions and decisions taken in the name of national security, religious freedom, as Ellie is showing in her dissertation, and other dominant languages of politics. Here you're looking at a photo of a giant picnic in Tecate, Mexico, on the border in 2017, on the day that Trump announced one of his bans. It's a dining table straddling the border with Mexico, connecting people in both countries for a shared meal. This giant picnic along the border was the brainchild of an artist who's been recognized globally for creating art in unexpected places. No one knows his real name. He identifies as JR, and he disguises himself with sunglasses and a fedora when he's out in public. Next slide, please, Carlos. JR is also known for this installation, which many of you may have seen, which is actually next to the site of the shared meal on the border. It's a huge scaffolding of the image of a one-year-old boy named Kikito peering over the wall. This boy and his family live near the installation in Mexico, but cannot cross over to see the boy's face from the US side. Next slide. One journalist has described the CBP as part police force, part occupying army, and part frontier cavalry. That's the CBP I encountered at O'Hare, the frontier cavalry. But it is not only CBP officers, American conservatives, or Christian nationalists who are immersed in the theology of national security. It's all of us. It would be a mistake, I think, to reduce the religious and theological aspects of national security to a univocal white Christian nationalism that is defined by the denigration of racial and religious others. This is the main narrative that I see these days. And while I don't entirely disagree with it, I think we need a slightly different story. This narrative has influenced recent work about the religious right's threat to American democracy, such as Gorski and Perry's new book, The Flag and the Cross. Approaching national security as political theology allows us to put liberal anxieties about a monolithic and racially homogenizing Christian nationalism in perspective, not to forget about it, but to keep it in perspective. No one is exempt from the exclusionary aspects of the American project, including measures taken in the name of national security, deference to plenary power, and the violence enacted in the name of border sovereignty and security. The ban emerges here for me as a quixotic and desperate attempt to manage uncertainty, to grapple with human limits, to locate a language in which to acknowledge human limitations and fears. This is perhaps why it did resonate as so widely. It indexes fears of climate emergency, demographic transformation, economic insecurity, and indeed the demise of white supremacy. It spoke to a sense among many Americans that current configurations of economic and political power are inadequate to the task of governing justly. Nadia Marzuki shows that such attempts to manage collective anxiety do not always travel under the heading of religion. I think she's right. In our case, they travel under the heading of national security. It invokes intense and often contradictory impulses to transcend our American order, whether to escape it or to legitimate it, to paraphrase Robert Yell. Its social force goes beyond the law. It has a capacity to transcend the law, to be both inside and outside of it, opening onto a space that the law only aspires to touch, only partially subject to human oversight and control, at the threshold of human powers, affirming commitments made at the limits of reason. Today, I'm going to wrap up soon, so hang on. Today, we have, I think, the resources to build on in order to reframe our understanding of sovereignty and border security. In his book, Divine Democracy, Miguel Vater refutes what he describes as the abolitionist hypothesis found in the modern theorem of secularization. It's a very wordy way of putting something I think we've been saying over and over again in this conference. In his book, The Democratic Sublime on Aesthetics and Popular Assembly, political theorist Jason Frank uses the concept of the democratic sublime to describe new forms of political enchantment that are elicited and required by the emergence of popular sovereignty. To describe the people as sublime, suggests Frank, suggests a limit experience that decenters the subject in the face of vast powers that exceed it. The sublime elevates the subject beyond itself to transcend itself. Meeting political theory halfway, perhaps, religious studies is also turning toward fundamental questions of the political. In his thought-provoking review of Winnie's wonderful book, Ecclesia, Carlos proposes that we pursue an analysis that conceptualizes the theological political more in terms of techniques, practices, forms of subjectivation, affectivity, and embodiment, and less in terms of sovereignty and its unity. It seems that such a disjunction would be called forth in a culture and a history in which the theological political flesh, where the normative and somatic intersect, was never really contained in a monarch's body. This seems right to me. National security is a location in which the normative and somatic intersect powerfully. It is a technique, practice, and the form of subjectivation, affectivity, and embodiment. Finally, writing in praise of Paul Kahn, J. Cameron Carter has suggested that imagining a decisive break between the secular and the theological is really not the best way to understand modern politics. And he concludes that modern secular politics is itself a new mode of the religious. In his critique of Kahn, he says that Kahn's political theology fails to examine the making of subjects, objects, and abjects in the constitution and in the telos of the politico-theological field of political experience, thus eliciting the question of what an account of modern political experience and US exceptionalism in particular might look like if it were tied to actual bodies in the world. I thought this was very interesting to think next to some of Carlos's writings in particular. Carter cites a host of Black intellectuals who've already been doing this work, who have been about the task of describing and re-narrating death, he writes, of trying to think through a new and think toward a new future of atonement and a new future of the political. Like many of you, perhaps, I too am interested in new futures of the political, in how joint forays into political theology and political theory, as I've tried to gesture toward today, might shake loose our ingrained understandings of contemporary politics, including understanding of its limits and its borders. When it comes to the US border, most discussions that I've encountered have settled on the idea that unless something has gone wrong, the religious is segregated from the political. Political theology is seen as a different domain, the domain of theologians or religious studies scholars, while security studies is taken over by those who are experts in national security. This division not only relies on a very limited construal of the religious, as I've suggested, but more importantly, it makes it impossible for us to understand and grapple with the sacralization of politics and national security, the pervasive sense that it is out of our reach and beyond our control. It also invisibilizes what the organizers of this workshop describe as insubordinate, undisciplined, or undocile religiosities. It makes it difficult to grapple with how certain political ideas seem to have a capacity to rise above and operate simultaneously within and outside the law, and also how efforts to contest and remake them do the same. Thanks. I hope I was slow enough without putting everyone to sleep. Last slide, where I say thank you and have some pretty new art from Nogales to brighten our perspective. I look forward to your conversation. And if you speak slowly, I can do it without these, unless you're from Argentina, in which case. Sorry.
Thank you, Beth. So we have thank you, Beth, for a fantastic talk and very mobilizing.
Thank you for having
very
me.
provoking. So we have room for comments, questions, observations. We can take a first round. We actually have plenty of time.
Muchas gracias, Elizabeth, por tu presentación. Muy interesante, muchas cosas muy sugestivas. Me gustaría que pudieras, hay un punto que me gustó mucho de lo que presentaste, que me gustaría pedirte que lo ampliaras, y es en esos espacios o momentos, o no sé cómo llamarlos, en que hay una simultaneidad entre lo religioso y lo político, ¿no? Que evidencia que se va más allá de pensar un solo orden, ¿no? Y que de alguna manera esa simultaneidad también nos permite pensar en esas maneras de subversión, ¿no? O en esas maneras en las cuales se complica o se desordena o se desestabilizan los órdenes establecidos, y digamos el poder de esa simultaneidad que puede ser tremendamente poderosa en términos emancipatorios, uno lo podría pensar así, pero también podría ser lo contrario, ¿no? Pues sospecho que no solamente tiene como una fuga, digamos, emancipatoria o transformadora, sino que también puede generar un revés extraño. Me gustaría mucho que pudieras como profundizar en esa reflexión que me pareció, que me gustó mucho. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Elena. I'm not sure. Oh, sorry. What? You want me to take a bunch of them? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Let's take more than one if you prefer. Any way you like. Maybe just one by one's easier with all this back and forth between languages. So the simultaneity. I think that. I mean, I'm trying to understand if you're talking about it, you know, from the outside as someone who studies social movements, for example, as you do, when this might give you kind of a more expansive imaginary looking in to think about the simultaneity and to be able to play with the different possibilities for emancipation or for repression or domination that it might avail. I'm not sure that I have a specific example in mind. But it sounds like your question, it sounds to me like maybe you do, that maybe you are thinking of a particular issue or movement or place or time that this resonates with, this idea of the simultaneity. Tal vez, maybe, okay.
Solamente para aclararlo, es decir, sí resuena, pero más allá de lo que yo te pueda contar, me interesa.
Sorry, too fast. I have to go for this unless you go really slowly. So. Okay. Lista.
Vale. No, me refiero, más allá de lo que yo, pues, de lo que resuena, ¿no? De lo que me resuena a mí, me gustaría que tú pudieras como profundizar en ese ejemplo que pusiste, ¿no? También un poco trayendo a colación esa obra del picnic. Gracias. ¿Cómo lo estabas leyendo tú? Como para poder amplificar, porque quisiera justamente saber hasta qué punto podemos tener como lugares en común, ¿no? De revisión sobre lo que implican esos desacomodos, ¿no? Que hacen que suceden, digamos, cuando hay una simultaneidad, ¿no? De manifestaciones que pueden ser de este orden o pueden ser rituales o pueden ser simplemente como cotidianas, ¿no? Donde lo político y lo religioso se expresan, ¿no? Y desestabilizan, ¿no? Los órdenes. Pero lo dejo más a tu criterio.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I follow what you're saying. I think what is interesting to me is to look now I'm getting direct translation into my own ears, is to look at some of these situations that are not necessarily usually thought of as political or thought of as religious, but that are rather not even thought of in those terms at all. And oftentimes the ones that I've been encountering in my work on the border are often artistic, actually. And I don't have any theory as to why that's the case, but I do know that some of the most striking instances of cross-border solidarity and of kind of alternative instantiations of community and of possibility for different kinds of, not even just cross-border, but really in a way kind of denying or not or forgetting the border. Many of those instances are artistic. And I think one of the most fun ones that I know about, you might have seen a few years ago, there was an artist who set up seesaws, teeter-totters. Do you know teeter-totters in Spanish? Through the wall, they were bright pink, they were hot pink. And they were only up for 1 hour because Border Patrol took them down, but children on either side of the wall were able to seesaw together. And those seesaws, those teeter-totters were taken down right away. And yet a good friend of mine, who's a historian and a museum curator in Washington, D.C., just curated an exhibition on the border, which Noah was just at. He happened to tell me he was there with his children who rode on these teeter-totters. And so she was able to make this as a part of her story, which is another instance and another space that strikes me as not a place where we go to look for the religious and the political necessarily in a museum. I mean, we may encounter it, we may not, but it's another example of the kinds of spaces and places that I found really resonate with different possibilities for community, solidarity, for thinking otherwise, and for creating, I think, different approaches to understanding not only the present, but also the past. I could go on with some other examples about some of the folks that I have met in some of my research in the borderlands who are working in communities across Southern Arizona and Northern Sonora to create other narratives, other histories, other possibilities, kind of in a proactive way that really doesn't engage much with this national security stuff and this sort of other side of border enforcement, border surveillance, border control, which is so dominant in the US media, and also really, I think, for many Americans kind of has captured their imagination of the border, when actually there are a lot of people doing a lot of other things that are just a little bit below the radar. And so I've found those to be really interesting, and I've been thinking about them a lot.
Hola.
Hola. Permiso.
Bueno, me gustó mucho la exposición. Tenía una pregunta que no sé si es válida, pero una arista de un lado de tu exposición parecía decir: señores liberales, ustedes también participan de la teología política. Y entonces lo que yo me pregunto es si vos tuviste un diálogo con los liberales a propósito de esta posición tuya, y qué responden los liberales a tu posición. ¿Qué te responden a vos?
Thank you so much, Paulo. Yeah, I think there was definitely that edge in the presentation. I think you were right. I think I've picked up on some of this. I mentioned very briefly the Gorski book, The Flag and the Cross. I've also just more broadly feel that there is a general sense that, the problem is the conservatives and the the Christians and the evangelicals and these people who are, avid, rabid nationalists in the names of their irrational faiths of various kinds. And that kind of liberal hubris kind of rubs me the wrong way. So I find it to be a way of exculpating liberals from their own complicity and my own complicity, although I don't really consider myself a liberal, but I feel that we're all complicit in this, in what is happening in our name at the border. And I don't think that I don't want to set aside the significance of the political movement and the social movement, and especially the alt-right and its violent manifestations. I don't want to ignore that. I don't want to minimize it. I also don't want to feel as if we focus all of our attention on fixing them and then we've washed our hands of the problem. Because I do think that there is a much bigger story to be told here. And yeah, I do think that liberals are complicit in the political theological aspects of this, this kind of collective reverence for security and securitization. In terms of what would they respond? That's a really good question. I think it would depend. I don't think there would be only one response. I think that I often, with my previous work on religious freedom, I was often asked the question, well, if you don't like this situation, then how would you fix it? So I would expect to hear that. I would expect, well, what do you want to do? Get rid of borders altogether and just have, kumbaya moment or just have, people flooding into the US or whatever the scenario might be. So I would expect to get that. So what do you want instead if you don't want the border? That would be one response. I'm not sure. I would imagine that other people in this room could probably conjure up a liberal to talk back to me. But I'm not so much interested in kind of going after or trying to, in a sort of accusatory mode, after liberals or conservatives for that matter. I'm more interested in kind of understanding the power of this discourse in registers that I'm not sure we've fully come to terms with, and I'm not sure we can fully come to terms with them. But I think that it's interesting to think with, and it also allows us to maybe have a bit more humility when it comes to, for example, the response to the ban, which was, among liberals and progressives, was a very loud condemnation of the racism and xenophobia of the court. And certainly there are issues with racism and xenophobia on the court. I mean, we're seeing that right now in some of the rulings coming down. Again, not to deny that, but that's not the only problem. I think that we just need to think more carefully before jumping into these accusations and assuming that if we could all just agree on sort of liberal civil society discourse, that it would all work out okay. I'm just not convinced of that. She's rushing to get her. Sorry.
Hola. Bueno, voy a hablar en argentino muy lento. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Mi pregunta es, se sentó. Son dos puntos muy concretos. Una es, ¿cómo, si has pensado en el concepto de religión civil, la civil religion, que es una definición clásica de Durkheim, pero también aparece, por ejemplo, en algunos escritos de Robert Bellah, que obviamente no tiene que ver con la tradición de la teología política, pero se ha usado para pensar sobre todo ciertos componentes religiosos del liberalismo norteamericano. Entonces, una pregunta era eso, si habías visto esa relación, si la tenías pensada, o bueno, cómo se conectaría ese problema de la religión civil con la teología política del liberalismo. Y eso era una pregunta concreta. Y un comentario, a mí me gustó mucho ese esfuerzo que planteaste por pensar descentradamente el concepto de teología política en su formulación europea, y lo pensás descentradamente desde Estados Unidos, con lo cual desde América Latina hay ciertas reflexiones que tienen que ver con la espiritualidad indígena, las cosmopolíticas afro, que piensan o intentan pensar descentradamente los modelos de teología política europea, pero me pareció muy interesante eso, pensar descentradamente también desde el liberalismo norteamericano. Así que me pareció ahí un insight muy bueno. Gracias.
Thank you. Hat tip to Carlos, whose work I was quoting, I think there, if I'm not mistaken. On the civil religion question and its connections to political theology, there's been a lot of work on these terms, and which terms should we use? Should we talk about political theology? Should we talk about theopolitics, which is Valentina Napolitano's term? Should we talk about public religion, a la Jose Casanova, or civil religion, going back much further? I find myself, I'm certain that there are, important connections between these different traditions, but I also find myself most interested, to be honest with you, in the ways in which they get used and the kinds of, quote, real world experiences, policies, affects, formations that they index as opposed to the terms themselves. So I think that I probably would be remiss if when I sit down and, have all the footnotes to this chapter that this talk is drawn from, to not cite some of the important work on civil religion. In fact, there was a part in here that I took out where I said, you can kind of choose your term. You could talk civil religion, you could talk public religion. And I think that they all have certain advantages and certain drawbacks. Civil religion feels old to me, and also we were talking about this actually in Ellie's Prospectus Defense just about 2 weeks ago, I always just think about, well, what's uncivil religion then? Which is not unrelated to some of the terms used to organize our conversation here over these few days. So I think that it kind of elides that as well, and presumes that there's this thing called civility, and that, good religion is civil religion. So I guess maybe I'm afraid of it falling back into the good, bad religion binary, that I'm looking to political theology, perhaps erroneously and naively, to save us from. And that may be, something I have to deal with. I would love to hear what you think about that. But I guess I've been struggling to kind of get away from discourses of good religion and bad religion and toward other languages, other ways of speaking the religious and the political, that are less indebted to those particular genealogies and histories. Thank you for speaking slowly. You can speak as fast as you want.
Okay, here we go. No. Okay, auctioneer. I'd be really curious to hear your reflections on some recent moments of I don't know what I would call them, but border openings. It seems to me, I mean, one of the things that is clear from your talk is that, it's a swinging door, in the sense that it's both its opening and its closing have a certain kind of effect or affect even on how this the issue of national security works. And I just want to invite you to reflect on two moments that I don't really know how to think about exactly, but seem really distinct in American political discourse. And one is Ukraine. And the massive opening of the border to Ukrainians fleeing that conflict. And the second that's received much less attention as far as I'm aware, but was quite pronounced, was the granting of SIV, granting of special immigrant visas to Afghan collaborators who worked with the U.S. military and came to the United States and were housed in processing camps for many, many months. How might, if you were to sort of update this chapter to think in a period beyond the Muslim ban to this current period of these two moments, how might that kind of inflect the sorts of things you're thinking about?
I'm not sure. I think that, you know, it's funny. I was teaching a class to high school teachers at the Newberry Library, and we were talking about people were asking about the Ukrainian situation and all of the dispensations that were made and the kind of exceptionalism. And I was actually looking back at some of the history of American immigration policy. It's kind of nothing but a series of exceptions. And so it's almost more like the Ukrainian situation and the Afghan situation, but I want to say something about that also, because I don't think it's actually working out as well as they expected it to. That those are more the norm, that there's oftentimes, you know, if it's not the Hmong people who, you know, from Minnesota who came over in very large numbers as a result of having cooperated with the American government during the Vietnam War, and also really in Cambodia and other parts of Southeast Asia where that war was being pursued. You know, that was an exception. They're just one after another instances of either crackdown or permissiveness in, you know, for geopolitical reasons, for reasons of, you know, particular situations that the US has gotten itself entangled in as part of its imperial projects abroad. So that's really the norm, not at all the exception to have like, oh, the Ukrainians get special dispensation, so-and-so is.
Some way, right? By partnering with the army or the kind of imaginaries around Ukraine and freedom. There's a way.
An affinity.
With a certain sense of American. I don't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, an affinity with a certain sense of an American ideal around freedom, around which is performed through certain kind of collaborations with U.S. national security.
Although I would think that, I mean, just take the Ukrainian example, since it's so present. I would think that many of them would push back against that and say, no, we're fighting for Ukrainian sovereignty. We're not, it's for Ukrainian freedom. It's not an American ideal. It's our ideal, right?
Sure, but I think they've been co-opted into a certain kind of American imaginary, both an imaginary and a reality, and that we're not sending soldiers on the ground to fight this war that is very much one that impacts U.S. foreign
That
policy.
does, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I guess you could say that also, though. I mean, with the Afghans and the special immigrant visas, they aren't granting them. They promised them, and now they're not granting them. There's a new report that CBS has actually one of the best immigration reporters out there. I'm forgetting their name right now, but they have a report from 2 days ago, I think, that's very extensive on the actual numbers. So the promises, the number of folks who were actually brought over and put into those temporary holding facilities, mainly military bases, and then the actual numbers of people who are really receiving the protective status, getting the visas, getting the longer term, you know, this humanitarian parole is really very limited in what it allows you to do. It's kind of this purgatory in terms of immigration status. And so actually my retired father is right now working for as a pro bono attorney for 2 Afghan men who were indeed translators and, you know, part of that contingent of people who were brought over and then are getting denied. And so they're brought over under humanitarian parole, which does not give you much protection at all. So I think that the Ukrainians are getting very different treatment, and that is a big issue, and that's a big question, is why is that the case too? Because as you said, if they're all partners in the American project of civil religion, which to some extent I agree they are, I hate to put those words in their mouth quite that hard, but yeah. Winnie.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and Noah putting your talk this morning together with your talk just now. I mean, is there a sense in which Ukraine, there's like America, Israel, there's America, Ukraine, America, Afghanistan. I think that's what Noah was saying, that this morning you were suggesting that, in fact, it's not that America is everywhere, but that there are these extensions of space in which America gets. So that was just really a comment. I do think that civil religion in its formulation by by Bella is actually more than just about civility. I mean, Bella's idea is that the American civil religion is actually quite complex and involves, by way of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's speeches, has a capacity for self-reflection that I think some of the thinner notions that we're using now about civil religion really don't have. And it's, it's worth remembering that that Bella's original thinking about civil religion had a much more complex moral theology built into it, and that one of the difficulties perhaps with this sort of thin sacralization of the border, for example, as you did in this presentation, what we're missing here is that it's actually not religious in the way Bella thought about it, because it doesn't have this internal structure of capacity for self-reflection and self-examination, that at least as I read Bella. Anyway.
What is the it there? What does not have the capacity for self-reflection?
That you described in this talk. Just getting back to whether we should call this civil religion or not. Civil religion is a much thicker concept, at least in Bella's original.
No, I thought that was a comment, I think, right, Winnie?
Bueno, yo voy a hacer la pregunta en español,
Sí.
para que me sigas ahí.
Sí,
Y es sobre la historicidad de tu argumento, tanto sobre el pasado del concepto de seguridad nacional. Yo creo que habría que diferenciarlo entre un concepto más teórico, como seguridad, el problema de la seguridad y el Estado, y también como un problema más etnográfico, historiográfico, como el surgimiento de national security como cierta manera particular de entender la seguridad nacional en Estados Unidos. Y mi pregunta viene es porque tus reflexiones sobre national security me hacen pensar con esta etnografía de Joseph Musco sobre cómo la seguridad nacional es algo ensamblado en el contexto post-Segunda Guerra Mundial a través de unas infraestructuras de nuclear deterrence en Estados Unidos muy particulares, a través de unas relaciones neocoloniales donde se podían hacer explosiones controladas de bombas nucleares. Es decir, es un producto histórico muy particular que se reinventó con la guerra contra el terror, y es el contexto en el que tú llegas, donde el anti-muslim animus es un problema muy particular y es puesto ahí como un problema, digamos, con evidentes tonos religiosos. Mi pregunta sería entonces, ¿cuál es la teología política del national security en su origen, con su ensamblaje original en la post-Segunda Guerra Mundial? Es decir, si lo sacamos del debate específicamente religioso, ¿cuál es la teología política del ensamblaje? Y lo otro que me hace pensar la etnografía de Joseph Musco es que él dice que ese ambiente afectivo que se creó con el origen del national security a través de las políticas nucleares es el mismo modelo para pensar sobre, por ejemplo, el medio ambiente en la crisis ambiental. Es es el mismo modelo donde el ambiente es una amenaza por el nuclear fallout, ahora es la amenaza del medio ambiente que está cayendo. Entonces, la otra pregunta tiene que ver con el futuro de esa teología política. ¿Cuál es la teología política de la crisis ambiental que, como la estás leyendo? Es decir, ahí hay unas nuevas articulaciones de ese problema de la seguridad nacional que ahora son puestas en términos de crisis ambiental, que no están despegadas de la trayectoria histórica de la noción de seguridad nacional, como lo presenta Joseph Mascow. Pero entonces, ¿cuál es esa futura articulación de la teología política que se puede entrever ahí, como preguntas hacia el futuro? Entonces tiene que ver como pasado, futuro.
I'm not sure I can answer that one. I have not read that book, but it sounds very plausible.
It's called Nuclear Borderlands. It's about how the borderland became the nuclear site of nuclear experiments in New Mexico. So
okay, the American borderlands. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want to try to read my framework back onto a history that I haven't read that book. And so I can't do that. I'd be very hesitant to do that. And also to project it forward. But I think that it's interesting to take up different instances in which national security is invoked and then try to think through its implications from the perspectives that I'm trying to think through here in terms of the simultaneity of the religious and the political. But I can't do that. I can't simply take another context and do another reading of this without more details. So sorry.
¿Puedo hablar en español?
No. No, I'm kidding, of course.
My brain is not working
Of course.
anymore.
Of course.
Gracias, Beth, por la presentación. Me preguntaba si es que dentro del estudio que estás haciendo, porque también entiendo que llevas un buen tiempo trabajando sobre esta temática y luego impactó el COVID, si estás considerando ciertas políticas de border o de frontera o restricción de fronteras en contexto de pandemia, sobre todo porque eso amplía mucho más el panorama, no solamente hacia el mundo musulmán, sino también para China, por ejemplo. Y cómo eso podría quizá afectar o no lo que estás proponiendo, o quizá expandirlo hacia otras formas de entender esta teología política del border que estás hablando. Y cómo eso también afecta como estas relaciones de movimiento, de movilidad que todos vivimos, o sea, y que de hecho todavía es persistente y probablemente se va a mantener como un peligro, algo que va a estar constantemente volviendo una y otra vez, y en donde un poco esta idea tan globalista de abrir fronteras, hay que dejarla un poco atrás y hay que repensar esta noción de cerrar las fronteras por términos de salud global que puedan afectar en el futuro, y un poco relacionado con la pregunta que te hacían de medio ambiente, o sea, que también va a ser una de las próximas temáticas a abordar a nivel global.
Absolutely. I haven't specifically thought about working on COVID and the border, but I have had other people ask me if I'm going to. And it's, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely thinking about it, and it would probably be something that I would do as, in a conclusion or something like that, rather than doing an entire chapter on it. But yeah, absolutely. And it is impossible, as you were saying, and in relation to the previous question, it's impossible to separate, I think, the environmental catastrophe from the question of COVID and the question of mobility and mobilization. Just maybe another book. Sounds like a really big one. Absolutely, really interesting.
Gracias, Beth. ¿Está bien? ¿Se habló en español? Sí.
Sí, sí.
Quería retomar la pregunta de Pablo, primero como para de pronto enfatizar algo en tu argumento que me pareció muy poderoso, y es como, digamos, esta perspectiva de la teología política también implica no confiar tanto en la distinción entre lo secular y lo religioso. Es decir, en este caso no confiar tanto en que la política de seguridad frente a la amenaza del musulmán terrorista es más religiosamente orientada que la amenaza, por ejemplo, en el contexto de la Guerra Fría, en donde el otro es un otro ideológico. Y creo que parte del argumento es como desconfiar un poco de cómo se traza esa frontera entre la política pública más religiosamente influenciada y la quizá más secular. En términos ahí de la pregunta me parece interesante, porque pensaría que entonces digámoslo, lo teológico político operaría en un sentido muy schmittiano en ese momento digamos, donde hay un adentro y afuera de la ley, que me imagino que el tema pues justamente de la experimentación nuclear es un tema fascinante en ese sentido, porque justamente, digamos, también pone en cuestión un poco la función del Estado de proteger la vida al mismo tiempo que está jugando con aquello que puede destruirla. Bueno, creo que ahí hay como un... No, total. Pero también quería decir algo sobre el futuro, porque me parece muy interesante, digamos, en la estructura schmittiana. Beth, tú de pronto me corriges un poco esa situación muy ambigua, donde el hacer ley implica estar afuera de la ley, ¿cierto? Siempre se activa en la estructura amigo-enemigo. Y entonces me parece interesante lo del medio ambiente, porque creo que la crisis ambiental puede ser una amenaza, pero no creo que la naturaleza sea vista ahí como un enemigo. Habría una diferencia ahí, ¿no? Como que me parece interesante entre esas dos.
No, sino que me siento interpelado y tengo que hacer porque mi punto era que uno no puede hablar de seguridad nacional, así como no puede hablar de religión, porque es algo históricamente específico, de la misma manera que se encarna de muchas maneras, y ese era como mi punto esencial, que el concepto como histórico de seguridad nacional tiene un aquí y una ahora, que ella estaba investigando, digamos, que Beth investiga de una manera muy clave en el anti-muslim animus. Pero entonces, claro, la pregunta también es metodológica, es cómo poder comparar eso. ¿Cómo lo comparamos, por ejemplo, con el concepto de seguridad nacional de pueblos dependientes y subordinados? ¿Cómo lo comparamos con conceptos de seguridad nacional de pueblos indígenas en Norteamérica, que están amenazados por la seguridad nacional norteamericana, entendida de otra manera? Entonces era también era una pregunta más metodológica en ese sentido, pero entiendo, digamos, la interpelación. Lo mismo que creo que no hay naturaleza, sino que hay naturalezas ahí. Sí, sin duda la atmósfera es amenazante en este momento, y es parte del modelo que está en construcción. Perdón, Beth, pero se amplió la...
No.
Súper.
Está bien.
No, súper, vale. No, quería, entonces yo hago dos preguntitas muy breves, Beth, de pronto nos alargamos un poquito si está bien con todos. Una primera pregunta, Beth, que me pareció fascinante y que creo que nos interpela mucho, es un poco en la línea de Pablo. Creo que hay una crítica a un cierto discurso liberal progresista y a su buena conciencia, ¿no? En el sentido en el que tú dices, ok, está bien, se critica el Muslim ban porque, digamos, se lo caracteriza como xenofobia, ¿cierto? Y al hacerlo, pues el liberal que critica se siente muy bien, muy correcto, ¿no? Estoy criticando la xenofobia, pero algo muy poderoso en tu argumento, y en ese sentido, no es solamente que el liberal tiene una teología política, esto no creo que es solo el argumento, sino que la crítica liberal refuerza el régimen de sentido en el que la teología política de la seguridad nacional se asienta, que implica un trazado de la frontera muy fuerte entre lo religioso y lo secular. No sé si entendí bien. Me parece muy retador y mi pregunta va a esto. Además, me parece muy relevante en nuestro contexto. Nosotros lo vemos claramente en las discusiones, por ejemplo, en torno a la política o a la legislación sobre diversidad sexual, por poner solo ese ejemplo, ¿no? En donde, por ejemplo, el debate en torno al derecho de las parejas homosexuales para adoptar niños, hace algunos años en Colombia, básicamente juega en este esquema parecido al tuyo, en donde los dos lados refuerzan ese muro entre lo secular y lo religioso, ¿no? Vamos, obviamente el cristianismo evangélico conservador dice, nuestro argumento no es un argumento religioso. Estamos hablando de derechos y estamos hablando de derechos de los niños, ¿cierto? Y entonces dicen, una cosa es el argumento religioso y otra cosa es el argumento jurídico y lo separan. El liberal dice, ustedes están queriendo legislar desde su fe religiosa y ustedes deben acogerse al derecho secular. Entonces me parece un esquema que se reproduce, muy parecido al que tú estás diciendo. Los dos lados en el debate, el lado progresista y el lado conservador, coinciden en reforzar ese muro entre lo secular y el régimen de sentido que eso implica. Eso me parece muy retador, digamos, y mi pregunta va en este sentido. Y es un poco la relación entre el trabajo crítico teórico, que tú haces de apertura a poder entender de otra forma las configuraciones que están ahí en juego, y la dimensión, digamos, estratégica del activismo, en donde pareciera, no sé, me pregunto, esa es la pregunta, que el argumento en contra de la xenofobia del Muslim ban puede ser estratégicamente efectivo a un corto plazo, y entonces veo ahí como un double bind, como una aporía, ¿no? Esa es una primera pregunta. La segunda, si es más corta, lo siento, esta era un comentario, pero la pregunta más corta sí tiene que ver con la relación entre lo estético y lo político y lo teológico político, ¿cierto? Porque muy interesante, digamos, en estas imágenes, tú nos dices, y claro, es cómo lo teológico político también tiene que ver con lo religioso y lo político como aparecen donde no estamos esperando que aparezca, y entonces las prácticas estéticas entran en juego ahí. Pero yo me pregunto entonces si son términos finalmente intercambiables, el de, digamos, la relación entre estética y política, ¿no? En el sentido de que lo político implica corporalidades, afectividades, materialidades, formas de percepción, etcétera. Y lo teológico político, que también se juega en el trabajo de Winnie, digamos, muy claramente en esa noción, digamos, ese giro, digamos, hacia la perspectiva materialista de lo religioso, en cierto modo, que atiende mucho a eso. Pero ¿habría alguna diferencia entre la teología política y la estética de la política? ¿O serían intercambiables?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, you've got how many forests of trees have been felled writing about the history of aesthetics in relation to the political, right? I could not presume to answer that. I hope that they're not interchangeable entirely. Make sure I'm on the mic here. But they very well could be in how I'm playing with these terms. Yes, the critical work that I'm doing versus the strategic activism aspect. Yes, of course. I mean, I tried anyway in my presentation to be somewhat nuanced about the critique of the ban's critics who rely on arguments such as Muslims deserve religious freedom too. As much as I cringe when I hear that kind of thing, as much as I recognize that there is, as you were saying, you used the word xenophobia, that there's kind of an anti-xenophobic strain to that kind of argument that underlies it, and there isn't necessarily, you don't want to spend all of your energy trying to counter those arguments or act as if they're insufficient or that they're, wrong in some kind of narrow-minded way. I also find that it's important to, when you have arguments like that, and I mean, for me, the one that did strike me more than any other was the Muslims deserve religious freedom argument as a response to the ban, which seemed to me really odd. It seemed to me that there is space for doing both, and maybe I'm not right about that, but by both, I mean both the critical work, the more conceptual work that I'm trying to do, or historical conceptual work, and the kind of more strategic side of the work. I hope and I aspire to be able to do both, but I recognize that there are real limitations to that. For example, when, if I'm asked to speak to policymakers or to people who were, involved in writing legislation, it is not going to be easy to present a critique of national security in any register as, as an aesthetic discourse, as a political theological discourse, as a civil religion, as whatever you want to call it. That's not going to resonate. So I do think, and I still kind of hope and hold on to the possibility that those two registers of my work will somehow be complementary rather than contradictory. But I recognize that there's a real tension there, and that it's not always, there is a sort of, maybe doing the strategic activism side at some moments will undermine or even contradict aspects of the more conceptual or political theoretical work that I am trying to do. So I wouldn't assume that that's, a clean or easy row to hoe or a balance to strike. I don't think it is. I think it's challenging and hard. And, I'm trying to do a bit of both because I feel drawn to both kinds of efforts, but also want to be clear about the limitations too of what I'm doing. So I welcome that comment. Thank you. Oh, and for your reading of the kind of resonances with reinforcing the border between the secular and the religious, that's absolutely a part of this. I mean, I think that's very helpful that you said that in your initial comments, because I think I probably need to be more explicit about that. And I'm not sure how to do that at this moment, but I think you're absolutely right. And that is one of the borders that is being reinstantiated by some of the liberal efforts, and quite intentionally, I think. So appreciate that.
Hola. No, quería hacer un comentario que tal vez implique una pregunta. Me estaba escuchando a mí mismo en inglés y ya era demasiado. Quería hacer un comentario que tal vez implique una pregunta, que es que, retomo el comentario de Nicolás acerca de lo importante en el trabajo de Elizabeth, que es mirar a Estados Unidos desde la teología política de Carl Schmitt. Porque, aunque sea mirar a Estados Unidos desde Europa, es parte del proceso de descolonización y provincialización de Estados Unidos y Europa frente a frente, cara a cara. Y en ese contexto, un segundo comentario, para mí es interesantísimo, estimulante, que la categoría de teología política sea extendida a regiones de la política, como la seguridad nacional, o como lo sugería, creo que es Pablo también, ¿no? Y en ese mismo sentido, creo que tanto lo que decían Whitney como Nicolás de la cuestión de la religión civil en Robert Vela es clave por lo siguiente. Talcott Parsons le hizo mucho mal a la sociología, pero también le hizo mucho bien. Y no es por casualidad que el antropólogo Clifford Geertz era el tesista doctoral de Parsons, y fue el sociólogo de la religión en Bali. E inversamente, Robert Vela era el tesista de Tal Col Parsons, que fue el antropólogo de Estados Unidos. Entonces, yo entiendo totalmente tu voluntad de rehuir de concepciones antiguas que dicotomizan, además las dos cosas, de concepciones obsoletas que dicotomizan. Pero yo leería la religión civil de Robert Vela como alguien leería a Tocqueville, ¿no? Como un antropólogo de Estados Unidos, con todos los problemas que pueda tener. Pero ese concepto de religión civil potencia lo que vos estás leyendo de la teología política. Por eso me parecía importante el diálogo sobre eso. No es una corrección ni nada, me parece que es un diálogo que tenemos que tener entre nosotros. O sea, es el tipo de diálogos que valen la pena, ¿no? Estamos relanzando una cuestión, que es la de la teología política, y eso es una incitación que yo no hubiera recibido si no hubiera estado acá, y agradezco por haber estado acá y haberte escuchado, y al mismo tiempo me parece que hay que reconectarlo con esa fuente todavía inagotada, aunque sea haciendo fracking sobre Robert Vela.
Yeah, well, that was a comment anyway, so yeah.
Yo también tengo un comentario que me causó curiosidad de la intervención del otro compañero, y es que veo en Colombia también que hay una teología política en la seguridad nacional del ejército que se interseca con las dinámicas ambientales, por ejemplo, de cambio climático. Lo veo muy claramente en la operación Artemisa, que es una facción del ejército que está dedicado a pelear la deforestación, en especial en la Amazonía colombiana, que también curiosamente ha sido vista históricamente como una frontera, una gran área de frontera que no es de nadie, que está por allá lejos, que es salvaje, entonces merece como el tratamiento que le dan. Esa teología política la veo no solamente desde los enunciados del ejército y la policía como Dios y patria, sino en esa, como lo dijiste tú, como en ese que están investidos de poderes más allá de lo humano para hacer su trabajo, y eso es lo que está atrás, creo yo, de la legitimidad que tienen los crímenes de Estado en Colombia. Entonces, esta operación Artemisa lo que hace es perseguir a campesinos cocaleros diciendo que están deforestando, y en el proceso hacen cosas horribles como quemar sus casas, quemando aún más área de deforestación, y paralelamente el gobierno permite y da licencias para que empresas extractivas pues tengan poder para hacer pues sus cosas extractivas, pero deforestando aún mucho más, en mayor medida y en mayor escala. Entonces, ese doble estándar en esa política ambiental me parece que muestra esa militarización y esa teología política que hay, y que, no sé, creo que es como un área para pensar las transformaciones que vienen pues en este posacuerdo, porque lo que ha hecho Artemisa también ha sido muy, como se dice, avalado por el gobierno de Duque, en el sentido que les han dado condecoraciones, también se les ha dado condecoraciones al SMAT, también hacen ese tipo de condecoraciones con misas, y por último también, ¿qué era lo que iba a decir? Lo tenía aquí, un segundito. También se ve mucho en que hay un aumento en el presupuesto del SMAT para el tratamiento de conflictos socioambientales. Se ven las protestas que hubo en Hidroituango, se ven las protestas contra la minería, contra la reeducación de cultivos. Entonces, pues muestra también como esa capacidad de diálogo que hay entre los problemas del sur global y el norte global, resaltando una vez más que la Amazonía se ve como una frontera. Entonces creo que la frontera también se presta para que esa soberanía más allá de lo humano pues tenga menos ojos o tenga menos vigilancia, o estos actores armados gubernamentales se sientan con más poder.
I'm just trying to think a little bit more about this word political theology as we've used it today. I mean, I think that so right now we're at a time when, as I understand it, there's an effort to sort of broaden out political theology to and, to not leave political theology to the Schmittian legacy, but then to open out the lens. And as we were saying, both Paulo and Noah this morning, that other actors, grassroots activists and everything would be in thinking of them as political theologians, then we recognize and that theology is an argument, theology is not an ideology, and that the possibility of arguing about what governance can be today, that the goal would be to expand the actors and to recognize a much larger group of people as doing political theology.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think that, perhaps Beth, in thinking about the sort of opposition that you suggested between the US security state as having a political theology seems to be more in a sort of Schmittian vein, whereas the other people you're trying to talk about on the border, if you call them political theologians too, then you might sort of have more of a possibility of a conversation or a dialogue and a critique of the security political theology.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a very helpful way of putting that. Yeah. And I certainly, oh, sorry, is there another one? Oh, I'm sorry, please. No problem. No, my pleasure, please.
Hola,
Hola.
muchas gracias por tu presentación.
Nada.
No, yo tenía una pregunta que va muy relacionada con lo que Carlos estaba señalando hace un rato. Al escucharte, digamos, como yo pensaba mucho como en el trabajo de Timothy Mitchell sobre cómo se había construido históricamente la frontera entre lo económico y lo político y cómo esa frontera va cambiando y hay que verla histórica y etnográficamente, ¿no? Digamos que es una frontera relacional y en ese mismo sentido deberíamos entender la frontera entre lo político y lo religioso, es decir, más que definir lo religioso y lo político, entender cómo histórica, etnográfica, en el marco, despacio, perdón, de procesos específicos se va constituyendo esa frontera entre lo político y lo religioso, cómo va mudando, ¿no? Y cómo se instrumentaliza, digamos, la afirmación de algo como político o como religioso, como secular, como político o como religioso, sino también como religioso o como secular en el marco de determinados conflictos. Eso por una parte. Pero por otra parte, digamos, un poco como al hablar de seguridad nacional, digamos, no sé si te comprendo bien, pero un poco que más que un debate, en una tensión entre lo político y lo religioso, yo creería, te entiendo un poco así, es que no hay una intersección entre lo político y lo religioso, más que la preocupación sobre dónde se conectan y se sobreponen, estaría la pregunta sobre qué tienen en común lo que solemos llamar como lo político y lo que solemos llamar como lo religioso. Y en ese sentido pensaba así más bien, y tú lo mencionabas en algún momento, si la cuestión es lo sagrado o cómo se sacraliza desde lo que usualmente entendemos como lo político y se sacraliza desde lo religioso. Digamos como que en últimas, tanto lo político como lo religioso operan mediante procesos de sacralización.
Sí.
Y ahí, digamos, eso entra dentro de los conflictos.
Sí. We lost our translation in the middle, so yeah, I think I understood what you said. And I think I agree completely. I agree. That's a very articulate way of putting it. And I think that one of the challenges, and this is not unrelated to Winnie's comment, I think, of doing this kind of work is trying to look for the right sorts of vocabularies. And I think what you were articulating there was kind of wrestling with the limitations of kind of reifying that line between political and religious or secular and religious, and rather searching for, you were using the language of sacralization, which I realize has its own critics and its own pitfalls and its own drawbacks, but it is helpful sometimes for thinking through these questions. So yeah, that makes a great deal of sense to me. Was there anyone else you wanted to take before these were mostly comments. So yes, Winnie, yeah, absolutely. I think that part of the goal here really is to broaden the number of, or expand the number of actors and spaces and places and discourses in which we're trying to understand how different understandings of political theology may be operative, including those who are dissenting from the dominant discourses of national security, as well as those who are proponents of it. I'm also hoping that this kind of approach to national security, I don't know, I feel like it might allow for certain kinds of conversations about its limitations to become apparent that aren't necessarily apparent in some of the other formulations that are much more mainstream, at least in political science, thinking about it. These are not the terms that are usually used, and I'm hoping that this would create a different space for a different kind of conversation about it and some of its limitations that we haven't yet had. Just looking through my list here. Oh, I appreciate the reference to Timothy Mitchell, one of the greats in our field. But yeah, I think I should probably leave it at that, considering that we've gone over. Thank you so much again, Carlos, for hosting.
No, thank you, Beth, for provoking such an stimulating and wonderful conversation. And les pediría que pues, le diéramos un gran aplauso a Beth de agradecimiento por su... Muchas gracias a todos por su participación. Les anunciamos que, aprovecho para anunciarles que el próximo evento público es mañana a las 2:30. 2:30. No, para recordarles que el próximo evento público de esta conferencia es mañana a las 2:30 de la tarde. Vamos a tener a 3 liderazgos sociales de distintas regiones de Colombia. Del Chocó, del Pacífico, nos va a acompañar el hasta hace poco obispo de la diócesis de Quibdó, Juan Carlos Barreto. Tenemos también la participación mañana de César Cerón, que es líder y que ha estado asociado a procesos de comunidades afrocolombianas en el norte del Cauca. Y tenemos también a Sandra, que es una lideresa indígena del Putumayo. Ese conversatorio se llama Espiritualidades Políticas y Defensa del Territorio en Tiempos de Crisis Ambiental. Entonces nos sitúa un poco también en esa fantástica pregunta que nos hizo Pablo de cómo también articular estas discusiones sobre lo religioso político o lo teológico político con el tema de la crisis ambiental. Y tenemos también una conferencia a las 4:30 de la tarde plenaria de Noah Solomon, que nos va a hablar sobre el papel del Islam en recientes, digamos, revoluciones en el Medio Oriente, en particular en Líbano y en Sudán. Y teníamos en la programación un conversatorio sobre el tema, digamos, de la enseñanza de lo religioso en la esfera pública, digamos, o la incidencia pública del alfabetismo religioso o de la enseñanza sobre lo religioso, que tiene mucho que ver con una pregunta que nos hacía Pablo también esta mañana y que nos hacía Winnie, de cómo entra lo religioso en las ciencias sociales y qué implicaciones tiene. Ese conversatorio tuvimos que reprogramarlo para mañana porque la profesora que estaba a cargo de ese espacio no pudo llegar ayer porque cancelaron su vuelo, llega esta noche, entonces hay ese ajuste en nuestro programa.